Okay, so we are here with Dr. Berit Brogaard, who is a professor of philosophy at the University of Miami. She studies the philosophy of emotion and language and perception. She is the author of 4 books, which is amazing, by the way. So I'm really excited to be here with you today. What happens in our brains when we feel love?
So most of the stages that have been sort of looked at have been the stages we call feeling or being in love. So is that sort of the honeymoon stage of love. And during that stage, we see sort of a chemical profile that's similar to certain anxiety disorders. In addition, you will have, of course, high dopamine if you get the drug, and low dopamine, which still motivates you to seek out the drug, right? So there's a similar dopamine profile in the brain where you seek out the other person or want to be together with the other person. So most people, if they're in a relationship with another person, go through a honeymoon phase, then a struggle phase, then a phase where you sort of come back together again. And at that stage, you can feel in love again, and we would expect maybe slightly milder fluctuations in serotonin, so you wouldn't have as low serotonin, and you wouldn't have as much sort of seeking behavior in terms of, so the dopamine wouldn't be as extreme. And so we have one stage that's after the honeymoon phase where you sort of the struggle, the real life struggle begin, or the power struggle perhaps begins, and where we would expect to see some more anger. The other stages from there, if it moves to the other stages, is sort of a commitment stage. Perhaps you will reach a stage where you co-create, and that could be in sort of the most literal sense that you get married, have children, or it could be that you run a company together, or you have some projects together.
So I'm curious about this struggle phase. So right after you kind of are addicted to this person and you get that high, and you want to kind of keep getting that high, that struggle phase, what exactly is that?
When you're in the honeymoon phase, there's a tendency for your perception of the other person to be abnormal, and so you idealize the other person to some extent. Things that would bother you in other people will not bother you, so that's sort of overruled. It can even be seen as a good thing. In the struggle phase, you try to overcome the obstacles that you're facing, and a lot of people try to overcome them in the wrong way. So you will have people who try to seek a commitment at that stage. I mean, it's always the wrong stage to do it. So when people do make a commitment to each other, and they do it during the struggle phase, that's one of the main reasons that a lot of relationships and marriages don't last, because that's not when you should be making that commitment. Even worse, right? Some people might try to have a child together because they think that it will help with the problems that they're having. So when people find themselves in having, say, for example, gotten married and having had children, and they are still having problems, it's not like new problems, it's the same problems, right? They never stopped. they didn't actually make it to the commitment phase, right? They just made the commitment in the wrong phase, and therefore they haven't actually solved the real problems there in the relationship. Maybe you want children and your partner does not. Maybe you meet as students, and you never talk about where you really want to live when you're actually done and you're going out to seek a job. Maybe you really want to live in very different cities, even very different countries. So lots of core values that are not coming up during the honeymoon phase, and they can't come up because if you bring them up, you're gonna undermine the importance of them. They're not gonna seem important. The struggle phase is like when you start, when that lifts, right? So suddenly either you discover those core values that they come into conflict, or you knew it all along, but now suddenly they don't seem as simple. It doesn't seem as simple anymore. And you seem that the differences between you seem to be, they become a problem. It can be worse, of course, right? You might discover that that nice person during the honeymoon phase now is like actually verbally a verbal abuser, is verbally abusing you or emotionally abusing you. In that case, of course, there's no way, well, no realistic way that you can really um, solve that problem, because you would have to solve it by changing that other person, and that's usually not realistic.
So you would advise kind of making a commitment after you've resolved these issues.
Yeah, so there's other research that shows that's when relationships tend to last longer, is that when you have resolved those issues, and in rare cases you might just have run into someone who is just very similar to you. The problem is that very often it's not just a a cliche to say that opposites attract. It's sometimes true that you get more attracted because there's more tension, but that's also what gives rise to problems. There are cases of arranged marriages or usually arranged marriages, where because the people in the arranged marriages know that given their culture, they don't have a choice, they sort of allow themselves perhaps to love the person. So they never go through a honeymoon stage, but they might, in some cases, many cases not. Our ancestors would, of course, have children during that phase because they didn't have the option of not having that. And then they would have a greater chance of surviving because they would stay together at least a couple of years, enough that the children would be a little bit older, right? And so even if they split up at that point, it would be easier for them to survive, and so more of them would survive, and so they would have the same genes that would give rise to that crazy cocktail of brain chemicals and so on. So that's an evolutionary thing, but that doesn't make it something we necessarily want. I wouldn't say it's bad to avoid the honeymoon phase. It's actually great if you could.
Okay, so I guess one of the questions I had was if you can get that high, of honeymoon love in other ways. Is there any other circumstance that you could feel that?
Yeah, it tends to be the case when one person loses interest in the other later on in the relationship. So if you are still very much interested in continuing the relationship with the other person, and you love the person, but they are losing interest, maybe they're gaining interest in someone else. Maybe they're having an affair. Those would be examples where the person who is sort of paradoxically, but the person who is cheated on might feel the same sort of feelings that they would feel during the honeymoon phase.
Wow.
And then of course there are ways that you can have intermittent feelings like that. So by changing up the routine in different ways. I think friends entering into a friendship in some cases can have something like that.
I mean, is there any circumstance where you could kind of train yourself to not need people? And I guess what I mean by that is if you were never to get these dopamine or serotonin through platonic relationships or romantic ones, what happens to your brain, and is that okay?
it, yeah, it's usually okay. It depends on what kind of brain you have. And by that, I also mean like what kind of personality you have. So people differ in how much excitement they naturally need to feel happy in not just in the joy sense, right, or excitement sense, but to flourish, to experience well-being. Some people need more excitement than others, right? So um, there are also people who need other people more than others, and that's part of being. So if you need people around you a lot, that's one of the facets of being extroverted. And if you need a lot of alone time, that's one of the facets of being introverted. And if you people differ in that way, and it's very difficult to change your personality, though it changes all the time. But it usually changes so slowly that we don't really realize how much it changes until we suddenly think about, oh, how strange that 15 years ago I really did this for this or this, or I like this or this or this, right? So, so we do change, but it's usually so slowly that we don't think that we're changing unless we sort of stop and think about it. And there are ways to try to change your personality.
What are some ways that you might change your personality?
So around 50% is genetic, or as a result of genes, and then the other 50%, yeah, you can in principle change that, but yeah. So what to do? Well, you have to first maybe start acting in accordance with that trait that you are trying to push. I mean, so let's do something simple. Or maybe that's not simple. Let's say you are naturally, or not naturally, you grew up as to be a disagreeable person. You're not forced to act on your personality, right? You're just very tempted to do it. So by creating a new habits, so you'll probably fail most of the time, but maybe you'll become better and better at it. So you can start to try to act as an agreeable person, and then probably in the end you will not end up being super agreeable, but maybe you will end up falling in the middle because you can change those 50% again. But that also means that if you fall in the middle, then you're a pretty normal, healthy person, because that's where you do want to fall. I think that the ancient philosophers, I mean, Aristotle was right. He thought that they were habits. I mean, he wrote a lot about how you actually could cultivate what he called them virtues. And virtues for him were never being on the extreme of anything. It was sort of always in the middle. So never being angry was not a virtue for him, for Aristotle, because sometimes you should be angry, and according to him, but always being angry about everything, right? Would be the other extreme, and so that would be not a virtue either. So if you think of it that way, yeah, you can create habits by cultivating it.
Thank you so much.